Hello, everybody. Welcome to Appreciating Poetry with me, your host, Greg Kelly, PhD. Last week, well, for the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at social commentary, social criticism in poetry. Uh, Generally, when we speak of poetry, we mean lyric poetry. And lyric poetry is the poetry that owes its origin to song. And the idea of lyric poetry from ancient times is that we burst into song in order to express our feelings. So, I mean, obviously there are other kinds of poetry, notably narrative poetry like ballads or epics. But lyric poetry is the kind of poetry that we mean when we just use the word poetry in general. Uh, and it refers to poetry often in specific forms that express feelings. Um, and I think it's very striking that throughout the history of poetry, through the history of literature, there has been literature that criticizes society, that the world of people is not what it ought to be. And we saw this with a very strong working class emphasis in London by William Blake, that men, women, children who should be in something like the world of innocence, or a world in which innocence and experience exist in a healthy relation, namely the rural area, the farm. They've been driven into the city by Blake's time in history, which is the late 18th, early 19th century. And the picture we get in London is a picture of just extraordinary suffering, that everybody in London shows marks of weakness, marks of woe. Men, especially the hapless soldier whose sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Children like the chimney sweeper who cries, "Weep, weep," announcing his service. And most scathingly, the youthful harlot, the young sex worker who blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hers. So this these word choices of crying and weeping and blasting and blighting with plagues, extremely strong language. Now, Milton also offers social critique. And I think, what binds Milton and Blake, although they're very different, is the idea that a person with any feeling is going to disapprove of the way society works, specifically in the modern age. Now, Milton, I'm sorry, I'm seeing the word Milton here. Wordsworth comes at social critique from a middle class perspective. Wordsworth is someone who believes in the ancient English dower of inward happiness. In other words, we should be the beneficiaries of a kind of inheritance of inward happiness Uh, but we're not. We're in a state of moral stagnation. England is a fen of stagnant waters. Uh, what we need are manners, virtue, freedom, and power. And no more than Blake, Wordsworth doesn't offer solutions. Um, Blake is just pointing out that in the modern world, innocence exploits, I'm sorry, experience exploits innocence, that the vulnerable are further wounded by power in society. Wordsworth, on the other hand, says we need power. So we feel that we have been deprived of power, just as we have been deprived of the ancient English dower of inward happiness. This word forfeit, I didn't emphasize very much last week, but it's a very important word because it doesn't just mean to lose, it kind of means to justly lose something. That is to say, that the loss of something valuable has come about because of one's own blameworthy actions. And what is this blameworthy action? It's that we are selfish men. Now, the attack on selfishness is much more intense in Blake. And I don't mean at all to make invidious comparison. Indeed, I strongly approve of Wordsworth's including himself in the problem, right? It's not that they are selfish men, right? We have these emblems of power, very sophisticated rhetoric that identifies different institutions by means of certain objects that are emblematic of that institution. This is a figure of speech called metonymy that employs association instead of substitution like metaphor. So the institution of the church is associated with the altar, especially the rather conservative Church of England that resembles the Roman Church from which it broke in the 16th century in a lot of its liturgy and rituals. Similarly, sword is like the emblem of the military. Pen is a dual emblem of both letters, scholarship, and of legislation. Fireside, emblem of the family. Now, this rather obnoxious phrase, the heroic wealth of hall and bower. So this is the aristocracy, right? People who live in great houses with the big hall, the bower, which is a shady garden, emphasizing that the big house is on a big tract of land in a park. And it's rather troubling to me that Wordsworth identifies the wealth of the aristocracy as heroic. Well, this goes to the ancient history, really, of aristocracy as knights, who were the retainers of the king. Of course, there's been a lot of conflict over the years between monarchy and aristocracy. But the aristocracy, I mean, they still call themselves with titles like Duke or Earl, that harken back to their not only their landowning power, but also their military power. So is the wealth heroic? Well, no, it just isn't. Nevertheless, and notice we are selfish men, so we who are in the church hierarchy, we who are military officers, not the hapless soldier, we who wield the pen and go to great universities, we who uh, have the great blessings of home and family, um, and we who at least get invited over once in a while to visit the heroic wealth of Hall and Bower. It's very important that Wordsworth includes himself in this power structure, only to say that we have forfeited our happiness because we are selfish men. So that's pretty good. Okay, now getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. This is another very closely related sonnet. And so we have squandered our powers, plural, very nice. And we do it by getting and spending. So we are selfish men, give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. We have forfeited our happiness. Here we lay waste our powers by getting and spending. And this contrary motion here is really good. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. I don't quite know what to make of late and soon, but they're opposed terms. Getting and spending are also opposed terms. But notice, if we have money to spend, we get nice things. And if we make money, we have money to spend. So getting and spending are two sides of the same coin. Sorry for the economic metaphor. Okay, so here's what's a little step up in this poem. Wordsworth is not, at least the early Wordsworth, the strong Wordsworth, is not at home in London, even though he associates himself with the institutions of power, church and state, military. Wordsworth is the great poet of nature. And pretty soon here, we're going to have to look at Wordsworth's programmatic statement, it's been called, of romanticism, of a particular view of nature as the epitome or the indication of truth, of the true, the beautiful, and the good. That if you're looking for moral guidance, if you're looking for the pleasures of beauty, if you're looking for truth, you look into nature. And when you look into nature, you see into the life of things. That's from another poem that's much longer than these little sonnets that we're going to have to look at pretty soon. We're going to want to look at pretty soon, because Wordsworth is the poet of nature. And in order for us to appreciate the poetry in this moment of history of the late 18th, early 19th century, we're going to have to understand Wordsworth's nature poetry. And I think this is a good point to get in there, that once again, Wordsworth includes himself in the social critique. So it's not they are doing bad things. It's not about us and them. It's that the world is too much with us. The world is too much with us. We are too worldly. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. little we see in nature that is ours. Okay, so this possessive is very interesting because obviously you can't own nature. Now people own land, and that's the source of the heroic wealth of Hall and Bower. Do they really? I think what we can say is that people exploit the land. People use land to grow crops. People use land to build houses on. We adapt nature to human use. So what does it mean to say little we see in nature that is ours? Well, it's obviously we can't see in nature much that we can possess. You can't possess stars. You can't possess the ocean. You can chop down a tree and turn it into firewood. But when we think about the relationship of the human species to the natural world, we say that we are part of the natural world and that we detach ourselves from the natural world with our technology. I won't say starting with, but very early on in extremely ancient prehistoric times with the development of agriculture, we begin this detachment from nature because of our exploitation of nature. Little we see in nature that is ours. So here we have to spin a little bit finely, I'm afraid, and notice that possessions have, or the possessive, grammatically speaking, has a broader range than we usually think. I mean, so when we're school children, we learn that possessive like ours, possessives like ours, show ownership. I've heard that from thousands of students. Right. So I own this pen. This pen is mine. However, it's very interesting that in a more basic sense, we talk about our relationships, especially our familial relationships in terms of the possessive. And since it doesn't make any sense to talk about possessing nature, it seems to me that this possessive has to be a kind of familial possessive. In other words, we see little in nature that is our relative. We don't recognize our we don't recognize nature as our mother. We don't recognize the animated nature, the creatures of nature, as something like brothers and sisters. Little we see in nature that bears any relation to ourselves. And that's certainly not because nature is aloof. It's because we've detached ourselves from nature, is what Wordsworth seems to be saying. We have given our hearts away. This is so good. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, right? So we make money and we buy stuff. And in doing so, we lose our abilities, our capacities for what? For emotional experience, for generosity, for intellectual growth. We have given our hearts away. Now, when we're passionately in love, We say, I give you my heart. But we have given our hearts away uh, to something that doesn't deserve it, namely to the world of uh, of materialism in the sort of economic sense. I don't mean the view of the world as forces and particles. I just mean the materialistic, the crass materialism of getting and spending. We've given our hearts away, and this is a sordid boon, sordid, uh, dirty, but just kind of disreputable boon. A boon is a gift. Boon is related to benefit, bon, good, um, and it emphasizes the receiver, right? So I talk about, I've gotten a boon when I found out that I had some retirement money I didn't know about. So that was great. The windfall. Uh, so we've given our hearts away, a dirty, disreputable gift to what? Well, not to nature, not to humanity, to what or to whom? And not to anything that's worth mentioning. Okay, and then here's Wordsworth, the nature poet. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, not for these, for this, for everything we are out of tune. I wish I could explain to you. I wish I could explain to myself what beauty is. What makes art beautiful. So I promised to teach you about appreciating poetry, how to recognize the value, to experience the value of poetry. So I think if we look closely, we'll get a hint. First of all, the winds that will be howling at all hours. So the winds that will be howling at all hours, you know. So I got a neighbor who's playing the saxophone at all hours. So it's like at all hours when we would rather not hear the wind howling, the wind will be howling. This is not a weather forecast. So this has got to be symbolic wind. This is nature speaking to us. This is nature bitterly complaining about what we have done to her. The winds that will be howling at all hours and are up gathered now like sleeping flowers. What an amazingly tender image that what is contained within something like sleeping flowers is going to explode and howl at all hours. So we have this relation, this connection between the winds that will be howling at all hours that are symbolic of nature speaking and nature complaining loudly, nature accusing humanity and howling in pain. But now it's just like sleeping flowers. There couldn't be a more serene image than sleeping flowers. The sleeping flowers, they open with this spiral motion. Similar relation that the sea is related to the moon, and the sea bears her bosom to the moon. So now then, bearing the bosom, I mean, that's a pretty intense thing, so the sea is pretty forthcoming. The sea is not holding back. The sea bears her bosom to the moon. We don't speak of a nursing mother bearing her bosom. I don't think so. I think this is an image of intense intimacy that the sea. Now, Wordsworth is writing. This is first decade of the 19th century. The 19th century. That's not ancient history, y'all. That's the modern world. There's steam engines in the world when Wordsworth is writing this. And the getting and the spending in the world is not from the feudal dues, back in the Middle Ages. The getting and the spending is capitalism. So in this modern age, this is 100, 150, close to 200 years along in the scientific revolution. So, I mean, Isaac Newton was well over a century ago relative to 1802. So Wordsworth knows the relation, the scientific relation of Newtonian gravitation, the relation of the moon and the tides. And the sea is saying, come on to the moon. I think it's also significant that the sea here is explicitly feminine, given a feminine pronoun, and the moon is traditionally feminine. Diana, the virgin archer. So the sea bears its bosom to the moon. This is a very intense and very intimate picture of nature as interconnected. And so it's not for these, it's not for the moon and the sea and the winds and the flowers. It's for this, for everything that matters. We are out of tune, right? We play with it, the way we can play an instrument, but this melody is not in tune. It moves us not. So I promise not to get too wrapped up in the technical aspects of poetry, but this is a sonnet, and the previous poem we looked at is also a sonnet. And there are English sonnets and Italian sonnets. These are Italian sonnets. So in English, sonnets starting in the 16th century had a particular form, but really largely because of William Wordsworth, who's just an incredible technician. Italian sonnets had a big vogue in Wordsworth's time, the last decade of the 18th century and the first half, really, of the 19th century. So I just will say two things very briskly about Italian sonnets. They're super hard to write in English because they have very few rhymes. And English it's really hard to rhyme in English. It's a lot easier to rhyme in Italian than it is to rhyme in English. So if you have more opportunities for rhyme, it's easier. So rhyme schemes in English sonnets go up to G. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. But Italian sonnets have a rhyme scheme. I don't know, this is too technical. Italian sonnets have a rhyme scheme with fewer rhymes, so they only go up to D or E or maybe F. So that's one thing. It's super hard to write Italian sonnets in English. The other thing is that Italian sonnets have a kind of broken back structure. So there's 8 lines with one rhyme scheme, and then 6 lines with a different rhyme scheme. And really good poets like Wordsworth, really good technical poets like Wordsworth, who is also a very strongly emotively expressive poet, they exploit that broken back structure of the sonnet, that you got 8 lines like one thing and then 6 lines like another thing. So if I can look back at the Milton poem at London 1802, we see, you know, we're selfish men, our institutions have lost all their power, we need manners, virtue, freedom, power. And then, so that's the first 8 lines. And then the last 6 lines is this very strange address. The whole poem is addressed to Milton, but the last 6 lines focus entirely on Milton and put the social critique aside. And this is not, I want to assert, as I did last time, that this is not really the historical or the biographical Milton. This is Milton as a symbol. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens. So notice that the imagery is quite similar to the world is too much with us. So I just want to point out this tonal shift, this shift in emotional attitude between the first 8 lines, shift in emotional expression between the first 8 lines and the last 6 lines. And this we also see in a very, I mean, he does it with sound. It's really cool. So the first 4 lines, quite abstract. The second 4 lines, these very intense, very intimate, very creative, and quite strange images of nature. And then these monosyllables, it moves us not. Great God. I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So there's this little motif, kind of unconscious apparently, of suckling, nurturing bosoms. I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, a worn out belief. I'd rather grow up as not a Christian. I mean, this is apostasy. This is heresy. Fortunately, in the 19th century, people don't get burnt at the stake for being heretics. But and it's quite ironic, right, to say, "Great God, I'd rather be a pagan." It's really quite witty that God, the Father Almighty of the Creed, has been reduced to just an outburst, an expletive, and ejaculation and interjection. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn, and now, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, this is very realistically nature, there's the moon, there's the sea. A pleasant lea, I think a lea is something like a meadow, and it's a land form, and it apparently is on the coast. We can see the sea. So might I, standing on this pleasantly, very nice, no winds howling, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, sad and lonesome. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, some some ancient god, a pre-Olympian. In other words, kind of one of those titans that came before Zeus and Hera and those Poseidon, those guys. This is not Poseidon, this or Neptune. This is Proteus rising from the sea, who's apparently some sort of shapeshifter. I don't know. Or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. So again, I'm not hugely familiar with either Proteus or Triton. What I know is that they're gods that apparently preceded historically the Olympian gods that we know of. The usual suspect of give them their Roman names, Jupiter and Venus and the other gods that gave their names to planets. These are older gods than those. So Wordsworth is making the point here that older religions than institutional Christianity of the altar and the heroic wealth of Hall and Bower, or for that matter, Blake's blackening church, that more ancient religions than that, and this is historically true, were much closer to nature. That before there was even polytheism, there was animism where everything in nature was alive. And Wordsworth, I think we're going to have to do that big long poem next time, which means we're going to have to spend several meetings on it. The big long poem I'm referring to has a big long title, which is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey upon revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour July 13, 1798. So we're going to skip back a couple of years. And I think what I'm going to do is talk about the aspects of social critique in that big, long, very complicated. I mean, I say long, it's not thousands of lines, but it's a couple of hundred lines. So we're not going to be able to discuss it in minute detail. What I'm going to do is look at a few particularly rich sections of just some lines here and there. I'm going to do that over several weeks. Some lines here and there in this poem that's been known to history as Tintern Abbey, although the title is that crazy long thing that I just recited. And I think what we're going to see is Wordsworth's close affinity to prehistoric religious beliefs of animism. Classical religious beliefs, that is to say pagan religious beliefs, and also a modern view of the world that is opposed to scientific materialism, that is sometimes called pantheism. It might be more appropriate to call it organicism. The idea is oversimplifying furiously, and I must say oversimplifying in somewhat a trite way, that the universe is more like an organism than it is like a mechanism. So I think we're going to do that. So I'm forgive my thinking out loud, but I'm kind of formulating a plan here. What I want to do is look at Tintern Abbey, spend a few weeks looking at some different sections of that poem, starting with social critique. And in the process, I might look at some other related poems, possibly even by another poet or two, to try to get a sense of this worldview, um, which doesn't have a great name, but we're going to call it for the moment organicism. And we'll take it from there. Okay. Thank you, friends. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.